This is Guideposts with Dr. Tim Stauffer, a podcast where Tim and his friends engage in purposeful conversation about identity, parenting, culture, faith, and more. Tim Stauffer is a professor of counseling and a licensed clinical counselor. My name is Sam Meyung, and I'm Tim's friend. My life has been greatly enriched by my time talking to Tim and getting his thoughts on many matters that impact my life daily. After listening to this podcast, I hope you feel the same. Guideposts are discernment markers. They provide opportunities for direction as well as warnings of pitfalls. Go this way and be careful of that way. We hope that each episode provides some sense of direction as we navigate the challenges of daily life. Thanks so much for listening. Quick disclaimer, the content of this podcast is for educational purposes only. It is not intended to be a substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your licensed mental health provider. All right, Tim, beginning our second conversation, part 2 on shame. If you haven't listened to the first part, you're definitely going to want to. We kind of set the ground for this conversation. But Tim, do you want to give like a 30-second recap of what is shame and how does it, what are the kind of implications of carrying shame?
Sure. Yes, welcome back to the conversation. Shame is an experience that everyone has to some degree. We can think about it as a form of insecurity or a sense of self-doubt. It's a deep awareness that I may not measure up. I might not be acceptable. There's probably something wrong with me. If you really knew who I was, you would reject me, or you may not think highly of me, which means I need to hide and I need to cover myself. I need to protect myself from your scrutiny and from your, I want to keep you from being able to see too deeply inside of me, because if you really knew me, you wouldn't love me. You wouldn't care about me. And so that's the way I would describe the experience of shame. Many people aren't aware of their shame, because they're functioning well, they're competent at what they do, they're celebrated in what they do, and they have learned the art of tamping it down. But when life goes sideways, you lose the job that you felt secure in, and you all of a sudden find out that you're vulnerable, that to injury or to problem or to sickness, we can find out our shame is lurking beneath the surface and ready to come out. And so our conversation around shame is how do we deal with toxic shame? How do we deal with a sense of this deep personal inadequacy? And so I think that's what's shaping up to be our conversation today, is what's our pathway out? How do we deal with this?
And you ended our last conversation saying the antidote to shame is self-compassion.
Yeah, I'm curious, what do you think of that? Just when you think of the word self-compassion and you hear that term, and how does that strike you?
Yeah.
And what does that conjure up in your mind?
Yeah, that's I honestly think, and I'm interested to hear what you're going to say about it, because I'm sure it's more than this, but my initial reaction to self-compassion is just be nice to yourself, just say nice things to yourself, be kind to yourself, kind of thing. But I honestly, when I hear that, I kind of almost think of that negatively in a sense, because I feel like it's say nice things to yourself, even if it's not true. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it's I think the thing that I kind of find myself internally being really? That's what it is? Because I'm sometimes I kind of feel like a schmuck, and that is true to some extent. And so to just be overly self-compassionate feels that feels like a lie. Does that make sense a little bit?
Sure.
So that's my initial reaction.
Sure. And I think that's not an uncommon, it's not an uncommon reaction. There is this tension that we have to deal with, that we are not okay the way we are. There is a there is a myth or a way that we communicate that says you're fine just the way you are. And it's
Right.
like, we all know that's really not that true. Like, no, we're not. We have to say that is to undercut our potential. It's to undercut our ability to thrive and to say that we'd like to grow and mature. And it's like we are okay. We are okay. Like, it's like we want to come to terms with where we are, and that's not problematic. But if we're going to stay in that spot,
Right.
that would be a big problem. It's
Right.
like we have to have this sense that our value is secure, but the way in which we have a lot of development to do. And I actually think self-compassion enables us to tap into our potential, where self-loathing and shame and like what I would call self-flagellation would be like an opposite of self-compassion. So if you think about the old monks back in the Renaissance and before, self-flagellation is the monks would take whips and embed the whips with pieces of bone or glass, and they'd actually whip their back to drive the devil out of them, or to deal with this deep sense that something's wrong with me. I think it's a perversion of interpretation of what Paul would say when he would say, I beat myself into submission. I bring this thing to bear on me. I pound myself to get me to this place. And it's like, I understand the metaphor of that. Like, we want to be self-disciplined, and we want to be firm with ourselves, and we want to give ourselves, a standard that we need to achieve. There's more to us than we know. And so we want to grow and develop and learn, but we cannot do that through the lens of shame and self-loathing. It's like we have to do it from the place of self-compassion. And I would say our self-compassion needs to grow out of the compassion that God has for us. And so when I think as a Christian thinker, as a follower of Christ, when I hear self-compassion, it's built upon the foundation of the compassion of Christ, or the compassion of God. And we are told in Scripture that it is the kindness of God that leads us to change. I think it's in Romans. The way it's often translated is it's the kindness of God that leads us to repentance. Well, repentance is a turning around and going the other direction. It's about we can bring about change in the trajectory of our lives, and that's inspired by the kindness of God.
Well, already hearing you say that already helps dispel when I initially hear about self-compassion, because I think initially my reaction to it is like, well, it's just a Band-Aid. It doesn't actually fix the problem. Mm-hmm. But when I hear you talk about, our self-compassion has to be rooted in the compassion that God has for us, I'm like, okay, now we're dealing with the problem. Mm-hmm. Like that's a power source that has the ability to go deeper than just positive thinking or so,
Right.
And so that already is like, okay, that's workable. Yeah.
I think like what I hear you responding or reacting to is what I would call toxic positivity in our culture.
Sure.
Like there is this element of just lie to yourself and tell you good things that aren't grounded in there's not a substance underneath them. And so we become toxically positive, and we just tell ourselves nice and good things. It reminds me of the Old Testament prophet that just said, oh, we'll just prophesy beer and peace and just everything is fine when the enemy is lurking on the doorstep and absolute desolation and destruction awaits.
Yeah.
And we just want to hear the prophets tell us that all is good, everything is fine. It's like, well, that's toxic positivity. It's not grounded and rooted in something substantive and real. And that's not what self-compassion is. In many ways, that's what the self-esteem movement is about. Many people confuse self-esteem as instead of self-compassion. Self-compassion is like doesn't jive with the self-esteem movement. And so the self-esteem movement is a toxic positivity that is dishonest.
Okay.
What self-compassion will do, and if we think about taking apart the word compassion, it has two parts. Com means with. And so passion means to suffer. And so when we have compassion, it really means that we're going to be with a person in their passion or in their suffering. And so we don't deny the suffering. We don't go to someone, now some people do this and it's terrible, but we don't go to a person who has suffered tragedy or loss and join with them with toxic positivity. And so many people do that when someone dies. They don't know what to say. And so they show up and say, well, heaven needed your child more than you did.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that's a really sick and perverse thing to say.
Yeah.
It's like, that's a toxically positive statement that's not grounded in truth. It's not grounded in reality. There's nothing about that is useful and good. And it ought to, like, that person would do well to hold their tongue and not say anything and just give someone a hug. It's like, we want to be with people compassionately. We want to be with them in their suffering.
Yeah.
And so self-compassion is grounded in that way of understanding. I want to be able to be with myself in my suffering without judgment and without harshness and without shame. So what happens is when we're suffering or when we're in pain, shame will tell us, you pathetic, rotten being, like, you suck, you are terrible, something's wrong with you. And I remember, I do a lot of work in sexual addiction recovery, and I remember seeing this meme or this cartoon where the cartoon character was pulling their head open, and inside their head was a parrot sitting on a stick, and it was squawking, "I am shit." And it's like, when I read that, and then the caption underneath it, this is what goes on inside the head of people with sexual addiction. And I read it and I saw that and I was like, that really resonates with my clinical experience. I hear that kind of internal dialogue from people. I am so screwed up. I am just fundamentally a piece of shit. And it's like, that is not going to get a person the distance into recovery. It's like that is a foundational structural problem where self-compassion becomes the antidote. Now, self-compassion needs to be built upon, from my faith perspective, effective self-compassion gets built upon a faith structure. As a therapist, as a follower of Christ, I will loan my confidence to other people about who they are. And I will work hard to speak the truth of what God says about people despite evidence to the contrary. And so in the therapeutic kind of world or in the clinical kind of world, a good therapist is loaning their confidence about the goodness of people, the fact that God created and declared man to be good, and that women are good. It's like, this is the hallmark of God's creative genius. And we have people as the result of God's creative genius, and he declares it to be good. And that's the most vital truth. It's the foundational truth upon which we must build our perspectives of other people as well as ourselves. Now, we also have to reckon with that we are broken, and there is something wrong with us. There is a problem. We want to be aware of the depth of problem, but the antidote for that is to root it in this aspect of compassion that's rooted in the compassion of God. God came and was with us and suffered with us and suffered on our behalf and laid the groundwork for real change to occur because of the kindness and the compassion of God. We are called to appropriate that same kind of perspective into how we see ourselves. I want to live my life with a self-compassionate approach that is built upon the compassion of Christ. And that allows me to be honest. It allows me to say, I'm really in a bad way. I really am suffering. I really do have a lot of pain in my life. And I'm sorry I have to go through that. I can I can be compassionate without just whipping myself for being an idiot, for being stupid, for being dumb, for making mistakes, for choosing the wrong thing. Like I can, all of these things around which I have culpability and things that I need to address, I can be compassionate with how hard it is to address that. I can be compassionate with myself that I've been traumatized, that I've been abused, that I've been hurt by other people. And I can look in the mirror and say, Tim, I'm sorry you have to go through that. This is really hard. And what that does is it lays the groundwork for me to be able to be vulnerable with other people. I can now say, hey, Sam, I'm grappling with this. This hurts me. This is difficult for me. I feel inadequate, or I feel afraid, or I feel insignificant, or I feel like I just really don't measure up in the world. And it's like everything is stacked against me, and it just really stinks. And when I have self-compassion that's grounded in the compassion of God, I now can connect with you.
Yeah.
And so there's, I would say, two aspects or two antidotes you might think about shame. One is this ability to tap into the compassion of God, and from that build self-compassion. The second is to be part of what I would call a confessional community. And my self-compassion lays the groundwork for me to be able to connect with other people, because confession is really good for our soul. And the scriptures speak to this, and so do the social sciences. It's like there's this scripture that says, if you're offering your gift at the altar and you remember somebody has something against you, go leave your gift there, go and reconcile with them, and then come back and offer your gift, because this element of restoration and of repairing relationship is good for our soul. It enables us to thrive within life when we can have healthy, open relationships and where we can confess with one another. James talks about that, confess your sins to one another so that you might be healed. It's like when I think about the word sin, it's like the lack of self-compassion is probably one of the most significant sins in our life, where we miss the mark. Like we think about sin as a target. It's like we miss the mark when we just beat ourselves up. It's not going to get us the distance. It's not going to lead to change for sure.
Yeah.
In fact, it will probably push us deeper and further into the pit.
It's not viewing yourself with sober judgment. It's not viewing yourself with the eyes that God views you. You know, he sees the brokenness, he sees the sin, but he sees the goodness and the love that he has for you. And somehow he manages that tension perfectly. And, but that's so hard for us to do. That actually, the way, you defining compassion, the with suffering, like, oh, that totally changes my understanding of that word. Like, it's not just about saying nice things to yourself. Mm-hmm. It's the recognition that you do experience suffering. And I think probably for some people that might be like, well, I have hard things in my life, but I don't think it's accurate for me to identify it as suffering, if that makes sense, which is probably just not true. Like it's not going to look the same for everybody. You use the example of someone losing a child. Like it doesn't have to be that for you to still experience suffering. But I think coming to terms with the fact that you do experience suffering, that we all experience suffering to some level.
Right. I think every single philosophy and every single religion that's articulated and well thought through will make some statement that life is suffering. Now, there are wishful thinkers who are shallow and who will try to convince us that that's not the case. But we all know it's true. We all know fundamentally. We all know the doubts that we have in our minds. We all know that suffering is lurking and waiting to pounce. And so we work hard to try to avoid it, but it's there and we know it's there. Right. And ultimately it speaks to our fear of death. It speaks to that element of, okay, our existential realities we are finite beings that are endangered. And if we get threatened enough, we'll go buy all the toilet paper and we'll take it all. Like, and there won't be none left. And we will turn on each other so fast. It's like the veil of civilization is very thin, and our barbaric potential lies beneath this thin veil of civility that can crack with just not enough toilet paper, with not enough. It's like, have to wear a mask for a bit. And well, now my freedoms are completely wiped away. And this is the most horrible thing ever. And it's like, we quickly react to things that we know suffering is lurking right beneath the surface. And so if we're going to deal with our suffering, we need that space of self-compassion coupled with community and this shared process. Proverbs says that he who conceals the way they miss the mark doesn't prosper, but the one who confesses and renounces finds mercy. It's like when we bring adjustment to our aim or to the target that we're firing at. It's like if we can acknowledge where we missed the mark and we can turn away from that, we'll find mercy. And self-compassion opens that kind of potential for people. The research on self-compassion in the social sciences is really phenomenal.
Interesting.
The impact, it's like teaching inmates in prison to have some self-compassion will change the trajectory of their lives. Because compassion isn't just niceties and it's not positive psychology. It's deeper than that. It's self-compassion is actually quite firm. It's actually has, like, compassion isn't always nice, and it doesn't always feel kind. It's like when I would go see my physical therapist after my shoulder surgery, they were very compassionate people. And then they made me get on a bike with my arm and make me work it hard. And they'd push me to the limit of pain. And it's like, doesn't make you feel good. Yeah, but it's very kind. And so self-compassion includes a deep firmness and a deep sense of, listen, this isn't about you just feeling good and having happy thoughts. Self-compassion is honest, and it tells the truth. It will acknowledge wrongdoing. It will take responsibility for it, but it also won't crush us beneath this sense of self-loathing where we're pulling our heads open and just saying, yep, I'm shit. It's like, no, that's not the case. I am working to align myself with the purposes of God and with the kind of person I want to become. And so self-compassion becomes a motivation to make the changes that need to be made. And then I do that with other people, and I allow other people to speak into my life. And so there are, I like to think that there are two ways in which we can attribute the difficulties and challenges that we have in life. And so we need to take responsibility for both of these ways of attributing things. So you can think about what shame does is it makes an internal attribution, or it attributes to self kind of all of these negative qualities and characteristics. It's like, you stink, you suck, you're terrible. Mm-hmm. And so we put that on ourselves. And so you can think in terms of, like, if Jim is depressed and he struggles to get out of bed, many people will just turn on themselves and say, I'm lazy. And that's an internal attribution. It's this turning inward, and it's attributing to self this character problem, mm-hmm. rather than having any kind of external attribution that's more honest. And so we could just say something along this line. Jim was unjustly fired from his job, and he's currently out of work. His mother just passed away 3 months ago, and he has a family history of depression. Well, now we're becoming more honest.
Right.
And Jim ought not lay in bed and just beat himself up and call himself lazy. He can acknowledge his grief, and he can be compassionate with himself for having lost his mom. He can also recognize the biochemical processes in the brain that contribute to depression. And that when we go through such life-altering events and grief and loss, and we are terminated from a job, and now we can't support our wife and our children, and we don't have any capacity, we don't know what to do, and our biochemical system is now fully activated in the depressed state. And it's like, if all I do is just call myself names and say I'm lazy, well, I'm missing tremendously. So we want to learn how to externally attribute things. Like we want to, and compassion can say, it really stinks that I was unjustly fired. That wasn't fair. However, I'm going to be okay. I'll be able to find another job. I'm going to work hard. I'm going to go take a resume course, and I'm going to learn how to build my resume. And I'm going to, and it's like, if I attribute, externally, and that compassion will motivate me then to bring about the change that I need, so that I'm not just laying in bed calling myself names. I'll go see my doctor, and I'll get on medication. I'll see a therapist and learn the values of cognitive behavioral therapy and the strategies for managing mood, both with medicine and without medication.
Yeah.
I'll connect with the people in my life who can support and encourage me, so that they can say something different to me than what I say to myself. And that's a very self-compassionate process that lays the groundwork for tremendous change.
That's great. That's huge. That I can see that, even that's simple, rather than, the internal attribution of just name calling, to then like, okay, let's accurately look at the things outside of us that are contributing to this current situation. I can see a lot of power in just simply identifying those things, to be able to be like, oh, okay, there's good reason for the struggle I'm experiencing right now.
Right.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Right. And so we want to bring that into community, and we want to speak the truth about what God's saying.
Well, and I think, again, the community piece, the community piece, and even the God piece is it's, I think I think this is the thing that I struggle with is, I know how easily I can A, deceive myself, or B, not accept what is true. Mm-hmm. Like actually with some coworkers at one of our staff meetings, we did a time where everyone just went around and we had a different coworker's name on a piece of paper, and we like encouraged that person on a name.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it was so wonderful. But also the entire time that, my friend who's saying really sweet things about me, I'm going like, yeah, I mean, okay. Mm-hmm. Like, you got to be stretching that one a little bit, and he was being so genuine too. Right. But even then I feel myself resistant to it sometimes.
Sure.
And so that's where it's like, if I'm going to even be resistant to that, well, I've got no chance of picking myself up out of
Sure.
it. And that's where the community piece feels so crucial too. And I think in our first episode, we talked about how much shame is in and of itself connected to relationships and community as well. So that's that makes a lot of sense to me.
Right. It's so it's a powerful process that it's really challenging to lean into, and it's why I think I call it what needs to be the primary focus, or the primal principle of spiritual or Christian discipleship. And I don't know that I hear that very commonly in programs around Christian discipleship. And yet I think it should be. And I think
so. When you say that as like the primary focus of Christian discipleship, like what do you think that looks like? Like what does that look like to make this an essential part of that? Because I think I know what you're saying, and I want to hear your thoughts first.
That's a great question. I would say, can we be taught or told to be self-compassionate? Like, I don't think self-compassion is something that we can self-generate. Like, it's a gift to us, which I believe comes from God through other people. And this is why I think community is so vital, is we need to be told by others to be self-compassionate. and we don't have the capacity to do it on our own. And I don't know how many times I have introduced to this topic to people, and it's like a startling kind of, I didn't even know I could do that.
Yeah.
Like, it's like I needed to read about it. I needed to be told about it. I needed to be confronted with a truth that you're not being very compassionate with yourself, Tim.
Yeah.
Like, this is an important area for you to address. And if you're going to live well, you're going to need to address it, because if you don't address it, you will not thrive.
Yeah.
Because you're going to just be sitting there waiting. The shoe is just going to be waiting to drop. You are going to take hits in life, whether they happen when you're 20, 40, or 90. You're going to take hits. And if you do not apprehend and understand the spiritual nature and the process of self-compassion, you will suffer for it. And so we have to be told to be self-compassionate, and then we need to practice it within community, but we can also practice it internally. I remember when I first was learning about the idea of self-compassion, the book I was reading of that title by Kristen Neff was talking about self-compassionate exercises that we can engage in. And one of those was to give yourself a hug. And I remember reading it, and I had that exact response.
Yeah.
There's this biochemical reality about physical touch that produces a significant release of the neurotransmitter oxytocin, which is the biochemical process of how we feel bonded to another person, or that we feel safe. So oxytocin is powerfully released within a mother and a child that's nursed when she's nursing the baby. Both mother and child experience a rush of oxytocin, which leads to a sense of feeling safe and bonded and in a good space. And so touch has a way, warm touch has a way of producing that chemical, and we feel it. And so if someone's suffering, what do we do? If somebody's traumatized, what do? We put a hand on their shoulder. We touch them. We ground them through the gift of physical touch. And that can save a life, literally.
Yeah.
And so to give if we're really suffering and we're really hurting, and we give someone a 2-second hug, or if we give them a 20-second embrace and we hold them close, where you can feel the body on body, kind of skin on skin, the sense that I'm with you, buddy. Like, you can cry on my shoulder. You can be here. I am here for you. That can save a life. That can fundamentally change the trajectory, because it's a place of compassion. It's a place of, I'm with you in your suffering. So if someone's traumatized and they're in the emergency shelter, and the psychological first aid people show up to meet with people, they'll put their hand on their shoulder. They'll lightly touch them and ground them to a place of safety. Well, we can give ourselves that gift of touch. Like, we don't think about it. We actually think that sounds weird. That sounds crazy. But try it. It's like if you're really feeling overwhelmed and discouraged, and you just cross your arms and just rub both of your shoulders and say something along the lines like, Tim, this really stinks that you have to go through this, but you're going to be okay. There's more to you than you know. Don't give up. Keep pressing on. The Lord will be with you. You have good friends. You're going to make it. Don't give up. It's going to be challenging. It's going to be hard, but don't give up. And you can rub your shoulders and tell yourself that you will feel better.
Yeah.
You will feel a sense of, I like that. I was doing that right as I was talking about it. I had my arms crossed and was rubbing my shoulders, and it's kind of weird. It's like, just saying that to you and confessing it.
Yeah.
And saying, there are things that go on in my life that are challenging and that are hard, and I need to be able to feel some sense of groundedness. And so by rubbing my shoulders and saying, you know what, I think it's going to be okay. I'm going to find my way through. I have good people in my life that I can trust and that care about me. And I tell myself that it's like, it's a personal kindness, and it's true.
Right.
And so we don't want to lie to ourselves. But we do. So we want to tell the truth and compassionately say, this really stinks. This is hard, but don't give up. And when we do that, it's one way of expressing self-compassion. Many people react to it with this, like, that's just stupid. Well, that's fine. Do it when you're by yourself and no one will know. Just try it. See what you think.
Right.
One might be going into your bathroom and looking in the mirror and looking yourself in the eyes and saying, you know what? Fundamentally, God created you you're a really good man. And I know that there's a whole lot going on in your life that really sucks and it really hurts and you really feel like you're shit. But God created you to be a good man. And he's going to call that out of you. Don't give up, and you keep pressing on. Say that to yourself. Look yourself in the eye and say that.
Yeah.
If you have to write it on a script, write it on a script.
I know you were just giving that as an example, but sitting across from you saying those things to me, I'm like, I can do this. Let's go.
Right. It's like and I believe that there's this element of, one of my convictions in life is that I want to speak the truth to people before they may be in the place where they're experiencing that truth exponentially or in what doesn't feel like a mismatch in their reality. It's like I want to be able to communicate to people, this is who God created you to be. You're a good man. Like, now live into it. Let's do this. Like, you can grow and you can learn, because fundamentally you're a person of deep value. And yes, there's problems all over the place. And yes, it hurts like crazy. And yes, it really, really sucks. And it's really painful. And it's hard to know, will we really make it through or not? Man, the jury's out on that. We don't know. But what we can do is we can begin to say what God says about us. And we can start with where God started.
Yeah.
We can then do justice to the reality that, we're broken. We're jacked up in many regards. But that doesn't change the fundamental nature of who God created us to be. In fact, it's what motivates God to move on our behalf, because he will be with us in our suffering to redeem us and to pull us out of our brokenness. And it's like, God does that because we're good men. Yeah. Because we're good people. It's like God cares about us. And so we want to tap into that fundamental space. And again, it's why I call it the primal principle of discipleship, because it's from that now I can be compassionate to other people. Now I can take that message, that good news, that process of out, and I can meet other people in their suffering and encourage them.
Well, and I actually see this like really tight connection between this and like understanding the gospel itself, like understanding like what Jesus has done on our behalf in suffering himself to die for our sins, and and that's rooted in his love for us. You see the tension of brokenness and goodness all bound together in that. And so I think about people who are, you're right to say this is not the language that we use in Christian discipleship, the idea of being self-compassionate. This is definitely not the language I hear people talking about. But I do think about the people who I think are just happen to be good at this naturally are often people who I really think dwell upon the gospel and believe it for themselves, believe that like God demonstrated his love for me, that while I was a sinner, he died for me. Like, and it's in that space where the truth becomes clear. Right. It's like, I have brokenness, but I have a God who loves me immeasurably. And as you take ownership of those truths, then you can say, okay, like you can look at yourself in the mirror and say, like, I got a lot going on. And I'm maybe making some pretty big mistakes right now, but like I am still loved and there's still a way through and I can keep going. And, I think the seasons in my own life where I have maybe been the least compassionate to myself is I am not thinking about, God's perspective on me and my life. So I see those things being really tightly connected, which I think there's really good grounds for you to say that this really should be a primary focus, like with the way we disciple people.
Yeah. As you were saying that, it reminded me of what Dr. Mark McMinn writes about in his work about the intersection between psychology and theology, and how we understand what I would call the social science and the helping field of the psychological counseling world versus the way that many Christians or the theological space in the church may address helping people. And it's often that these two areas of brokenness, that one emphasizes one more than the other. So in the church or in Christian settings, we emphasize this concept of sin a great deal. And it's this element, it's like, we know that there is a rebellious part of us. We know that there's a hardened heart inside of us that stamps its foot in defiance of all that is good and right. And we know that we have the potential for incredible acts of evil, like not just doing something wrong, but we know that Hitler could be us. We know that Pol Pot could be us. We know that Stalin could be us. We know that greed, and we know all the processes. It's like we know deep within us that we have the capacity to go down some really, really dark and evil spaces. And we have that heart of rebellion and this like evil process that is, the seeds are there and they're lurking within us. And in many ways, that's the space that theology addresses about this fallenness and this sense that we are broken beyond the ability for us to repair ourselves. And we need the help of God and others because we cannot self-redeem.
Right.
And so the church emphasizes that. And they're right to emphasize it because it's a part of our human brokenness. It's like, it's not that's not a secret. And we all know, we're all grappling with how to deal with the realities of evil. We see it with Russia and Ukraine right now in profound ways. We can see it through all sorts of cultural issues across our country. And so we know that evil lurks within all of us. But then there's this other aspect, and this is where I think psychology tends to have their emphasis. And is this idea is that life happens to people, and problems develop that are beyond a person's control. So bad things happen to you, and it's not your fault, and you didn't do anything wrong to experience what you experienced. The 4-year-old little girl who's sexually molested by her uncle didn't do anything wrong.
Right.
It's like, and yet it shattered her life. The little boy who is bullied on the schoolyard incessantly, it's like he didn't do anything wrong to be getting bullied. And so these things that crush the soul and it destroys a person, it tears them down so significantly that we can look at those things and say, well, it's nothing wrong with that person. Like, this is the effects of a sickness in our culture. It's this sickness that has been foisted onto you, and it's not your fault. And psychology often taps into and tries to address it. How do we build up a person? How do we give them the structure and how do we scaffold underneath them so that they can recover and that they can thrive and that they can be whole? And psychology really focuses on that kind of space. And what Dr. Mark McMinn says is that we need to be able to do both. We need to understand that sin most accurately. We're able to make both that internal or personal attribution that we are broken. There's something wrong with us. We need to address that. We have this rebelliousness, but we also need to emphasize the external attributions of things are occurring to us that aren't our fault and that hurt us. And those cause problems for us. And so we have to do both of those spaces and let them live with intention with one another. And I believe that self-compassion and that community is the place where we can make proper internal attributions and we can make proper external attributions, and we can allow the community to help us get those straight. Because I want you, with you in my life, Sam, I want you to be able to say, Tim, that sounds like an unhealthy internal attribution. You're missing the mark there. Or I want you to be able to say, Tim, I think you're externalizing things and you need to take responsibility for your attitude. Like the way you're thinking about this seems a little jacked up. Like this doesn't match God's perspective. And can we talk about that? And it's like, I need people in my life that will call me to make proper internal attributions when needed. And at the same time, to reinforce the reality that the external attributions are critically important. I think that's the seed where compassion, self-compassion, compassion for one another occurs within community. And when we do that, we understand one another. We have connection with one another.
Right.
Our vulnerability is appropriate, and we're open, and we're willing to be exposed, and our shame is reduced. Right. It's like our shame goes away. It's like I'm not living in a place of shame anymore because I'm open. It's like people understand me and people know me. And so that's the way I would probably close our conversation of that's the antidote to shame as I see it. There are many other voices out there that may speak differently about the antidotes to shame, but that's how I frame it up in my head.
That's great. That's so good. I feel like I've got a lot to think about and try and work out in my own life. So,
well, great conversation, and we would love to hear from those of you who are listening, and appreciate your feedback and encouragement. If there are topics that you would be interested in us chatting about or questions that you have, feel free to shoot us an email. There's an email link in the show notes, and we'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim.
All right. Have a great day.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Guideposts with Dr. Tim Stauffer. If you're finding this podcast beneficial, please share it with a friend or leave us a review. Also, make sure to check out the show notes where you can find links to resources as well as an email address. We want to hear from you. Send us your questions, feedback, and topic ideas for future episodes. Thanks for listening.